be surprised if any of you today have ever heard of a football player named Burt Jones. Burt Jones was a quarterback at LSU in the 60s or early 70s, and then had a fairly good pro career. I'm not interested in the football aspects of his life, but when he retired, I remembered there was a magazine article, a business magazine article about him, and he was asked what he wanted to do when he retired. And he said, I want to be an entrepreneur. He says, I don't know what it is, but I've always liked the sound of the word. And in many ways, historians and economists have often liked the sound of the word entrepreneur too, but they haven't always known what to do with it. It's a very tricky word, as we'll see. The questions of how to define entrepreneurship, what do you do with it once you find it, and how do you measure it, are some of the most intractable but venerable in all of the economics literature. And I want to run through it briefly and think about some of the ways that people have thought about entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship over time. Many of you probably, when you think of the word entrepreneur, either names or attributes come immediately to mind. You think of Steve Jobs, so I guess you're reading Isaacson's biography of Jobs. You think of people like Hugh McCall. You think of people like Donald Trump. Other people might think of other attributes and other people when they think of the concept of entrepreneur. And over the centuries, people have emphasized in their writing on entrepreneurs different types of qualities, and many of the emphases mirror what's going on in the economy as a whole, and that's one of the more interesting developments. Today, most people probably associate entrepreneurship most closely with innovation or risk-taking, but at other points in time, other attributes have also been emphasized by people who write on the concept. Sometimes management in general, or the arts of superintendence and maintenance, as it was often said in the archaic way in the 19th century, have taken precedence. So even today, as you probably noticed already, there's not any real consensus about what an entrepreneur is, who is an entrepreneur, when does one act entrepreneurially, and when does one stop acting entrepreneurially. So there's lots of definitional problems right from the get-go. The qualities I talked about earlier, Weber talked about instrumental rationality. Keynes said that entrepreneurs have to have animal spirits. There's lots of different ways that people have approached the concept in general. Now, even if you could agree on a definition, which is difficult even today, you still have to figure out what's the importance of the entrepreneur and entrepreneurship. John Aiken and I were talking on the way over here today, and in probably what is the leading economic textbook, macro principles text, is Greg Mankiw and Mark Taylor's book. There's not even an index entry for entrepreneurs or entrepreneurship. And when they talk about the so-called factors of production in that book, it's land, labor, and capital. No role independently of capital or land for entrepreneurs. And you could look at a variety of econ texts. Some consider it sufficiently important to be considered a factor of production. Others kind of leave it to the side. So that's another problem. You have the problem of defining it. You have the problem of weighing its importance and seeing how it fits into growth theories of various kinds. And then you have a third problem, which is also important, is how do you measure entrepreneurship? It's largely a sociocultural variable rather than something quantitative that you can, at least in an approximate way, measure, such as land or natural resources, labor inputs, or capital. So in all those ways, it becomes very difficult to even talk about the concept of entrepreneurship. You can't say that Donald Trump is a 0.6 entrepreneur and Hugh McCall is a 0.7, Steve Jobs is a 0.8, Tim Cook's a 0.4, anything like that. So all of those ways, it's very difficult to kind of come to grasp with the whole concept itself. And this has led lots of people to kind of say a few nice words about it and leave it off to the side when they get down to the matters of coming up with a theory on how economies grow. I think as we've seen over the last 20 years or so, though, this is an increasingly untenable proposition, because I think it's fair to say that entrepreneurship and individuals or networks are increasingly important in the 21st century economy. So I think it will behoove us, I think, to spend a little time, one class in a semester-long course like this, on the whole concept, just to problematize it and make it a little bit more real to you. A few years ago, The Economist argued in an op-ed header, as they call it, that the entrepreneur is the life and soul of the capitalist party. So let's party a little bit today and talk about entrepreneurs in time. Now, most writers on the history of economic thought argue, or at least allege, that the first real theorist of entrepreneurship is a guy named Richard Cantillon, who wrote in the 18th century. He was an Irishman, although he wrote and lived in France, and he was, many people think, the first technical writer, at least economic writer, on entrepreneurship. Just for the record, however, the word entrepreneur was used 2 or 3 centuries prior to Cantillon's economic uses of it in the 18th century. It was used in France basically to people who were more or less engineers of one type or another, military engineers, bridge builders, people who built roads, people who undertook or adventured in some way. The French verb basically from which the noun is derived means to undertake. And it was used in a very generic way for a couple of centuries prior to Cantillon's use of it in the 18th century. Cantillon's an Irish banker, but he moves to France. He writes a book that's published in the middle of the 18th century, although he wrote it 30 years earlier. He had a hard time getting it published. Something sounds familiar. But his book is called The Essay, in English, The Essay on the Nature of Commerce in General. And unlike earlier writers on economics, and there had been some serious writing on economics for a couple of centuries prior to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations in 1776, Cantillon made a big deal of the entrepreneur. He thought the entrepreneur was important, and the function of the entrepreneur was to bear risk or uncertainty. He said that this is one of the key elements in understanding how an economy can grow or not grow. And you had to have risk-bearing agents out there. And Cantillon is still important even today, 250 years after his book was published, largely because he brought the concept of risk-bearing and uncertainty into the picture. And this attribute of the entrepreneur is still with us even today, if you think about it. Now, to be sure, people in the later writers really took up this concept and ran with it, most notably the University of Chicago's Frank Knight in the 1920s, when he emphasized risk-bearing as well, although he makes the distinction between risk and uncertainty. Risk is insurable, uncertainty is not insurable, and he emphasized the entrepreneur is someone who is willing to bear uncertainty and really takes kind of deep risks, as it were. So here we have Cantillon in the 18th century. Cantillon's work was picked up by a variety of other writers in France, and most of the early writing on the history, on the concept of the entrepreneurs comes out of France. And lots of writers picked up this concept of risk-bearing, and they used it with respect to whatever sector of the economy they were most interested in. A bunch of writers who were interested in agriculture, so-called physiocrats, wrote on risk-bearing in agriculture. Others wrote on risk-bearing in industry, and they thought entrepreneurs could only be real risk-bearers in something that was newer, such as manufacturing enterprises. But what we see for 50 years or so after Cantillon writes is lots of work on risk-bearing and uncertainty, mainly in France. Now, the modern concept of entrepreneurship owes something to Cantillon, but it's really the second guy I'd like to talk about today, Jean-Baptiste Say, another French writer who wrote in the early 19th century, who is generally seen as the father of the whole modern concept of entrepreneurship. It's interesting that most of the early writing in entrepreneurship came out of France. Ironically, many people think that one of the key problems in France today is a lack of entrepreneurship, but they certainly wrote a lot about it in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, some of you are probably familiar with Jean-Baptiste Say. He's one of the kind of leading classical economists, wrote some of the most important treatises in the early 19th century. He comes down to us today famous for so-called Say's Law, a shorthand way of saying supply creates its own demand. But he also laid out a very full and pretty elaborate model of entrepreneurship that is still important today. And it is so embracive that almost every modern concept of the entrepreneur and entrepreneurship owes something to Jean-Baptiste Say. Say did not deny that risk-bearing is important. He said, yeah, that's one of the key attributes of the entrepreneur. But he said there was something else that was really the essence, and that is successfully uniting the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, in some way, and it will differ case by case, so as to realize a profit. So in his view, it's this kind of magical, mystical way that someone looks at a situation and somehow brings to bear on certain combinations of land, labor, and capital in such a way as to realize a profit. So he talks about it in that way, but he goes on and he says, the people who can do this well have a certain set of characteristics that are not that widely diffused throughout society. He says that they must have judgment and perseverance and a knowledge of the world in general, as well as of business. They must know something about what he called the arts of superintendence and maintenance, or basically management types of skills. And they also have to kind of be able to know their place in the world. This is a liberal arts class, and in many ways what Say is doing is basically a successful entrepreneur has to have a kind of wide-angle lens as well as specific business skills. So if you look at his concept of the entrepreneur, he has risk-bearing in it, he has uniting the factors of production, he has management skills, almost everything that we today associate with the entrepreneur, except perhaps innovation, is there from the early 19th century, the first quarter of the 19th century, when Say wrote. Now, Say then is the father of the whole concept of entrepreneurship. But we might ask, okay, both of these early guys, Cantillon and Say, were writing in France. What's happening in the rest of the Western world, or the rest of the world in general? Just a brief aside, most of the early formal treatises on economics were written in the West. There was scattered writing in the Middle East, South Asia, East Asia, even Southeast Asia on economics, but the first real so-called kind of principles text that comes out of Asia was written in Thailand in the first decade of the 20th century. We're going to focus on Western writing today on entrepreneurship, although there are obviously entrepreneurs everywhere, and there were some scattered references to some of the functions that we today consider entrepreneurial functions in other parts of the world. Now, Say is basically taken up in the English world as soon as his books are translated in the first two decades of the 19th century. And the English then take up the French word, take it and bring it right into English and start using entrepreneurial function in English. Prior to that time, the English had a sense, and the Anglo-American world in general had a sense of what an entrepreneur should do, but they didn't really use the word. From the 16th century on, they really used three words kind of interchangeably to convey some of the sense of what an entrepreneur does. These three terms were undertaker, someone who undertakes rather than someone who digs graves, adventurer, and projector, someone who does projects, someone who adventures or undertakes. Sir Walter Raleigh, who was, for example, very important in North Carolina's early history, often would sign his name, Walter Raleigh, projector or adventurer. And it was used both with reference to other people and sometimes as an individual descriptor of a person himself, almost as an occupational category. These terms, however, fall out of use in the 19th century, and Anglo-American world begins to take up the word and the uses of it that were associated with Say. Now, one of the interesting things about the 19th century, however, in the writing after Say, as Anglo-American economic thought begins to become preeminent in the world, is that for a variety of reasons, some of which I've alluded to indirectly earlier, the entrepreneur is not seen as a key element in most economic growth theories in the Anglo-American world in the 19th century. And it's largely because of the kind of heavily quantitative nature of classical and then neoclassical economics as it developed essentially from Smith or Ricardo all the way to Alfred Marshall in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Individual variations in behavior could not easily be modeled in these quantitative systems, and they were seen as probably suppressed by competition or by the multiple reactions of consumers and producers and in a huge economy as a whole. Moreover, because of the emphasis on quantitative relationships between and among the more quantitative factors of production, it was difficult, if not impossible, to find a role for the entrepreneur in a growth model. Often writers would, in early chapters of books or in footnotes through a little, like a throat clearing exercise, talk about this entrepreneurial dimension, but they wouldn't ever put it front and center in any of the growth models that were developed in the 19th century. Toward the end of the century, in America largely, and some people think it's because big business rose so rapidly in 19th century America, and there were some colorful, illustrious, high-profile individuals with which individual businesses were associated. Much of the early writing on the entrepreneur in the modern sense came out of America. And we begin to see some of the late 19th century American economists, John Bates Clark, John Commons, a number of others, talk a little bit more systematically about the role of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship and try to fit it into their models. They don't really succeed, however, but they again are pushing in the direction of seeing some role distinct from land or capital for key individuals in explaining how an economy can grow or not grow, how a business can thrive or fail. It's not Americans, however, but an Austrian economist who really not only resurrects the concept of the entrepreneur, but brings it front and center into economic life. And that's a guy named Joseph Schumpeter, who was an Austrian economist born in 1883, died in 1950. He was one of the most illustrious economists of the 20th century. He spent most of his early life in Austria, but in the early 30s moved to the United States and took up a position at Harvard. His concept of the entrepreneur can be seen as early as a great book he wrote that is still used in some places. He wrote it in 1911, and it's called A Theory of Economic Development. And what Schumpeter does in this book is not only to talk about the entrepreneur, but he makes it the absolute sine qua non, the single most important element in explaining growth. Far more important in his view than land, labor, and capital generically. To Schumpeter, economies over time generally are in a kind of steady equilibrium state. And these states, over relatively long periods of time, are broken very, very seldomly by some heroic individuals who, through some act of creative innovation, as he put it, totally disrupt this equilibrium, and through some either new invention, new way of producing or organizing economic life, totally ratchet up economic performance and productivity and lead to a much higher level equilibrium. These punctuation points happen very, very infrequently in history. And there's only, a couple each century, and there are only a few of these entrepreneurs who totally transform economic productivity through some transcendently important innovation, which results in what he calls a gale of creative destruction, which totally transforms economic life. In the 19th century, it might have been something like steam power in the late 18th and early 19th century. The end of the century, electricity. The automobile in the early 20th century. Computers in the middle of the 20th century going forward. The internet, things like that. There aren't many, and only a few, the proud, you know, the entrepreneur. There aren't many of these people in history. It's a very, very restrictive, narrow use of the term. But in those few cases where entrepreneurs are there and can be identified with these types of innovations, they are of transcendent importance. So Schumpeter, after moving to Harvard, his books are translated to English, and from the 30s on, his particular view of the entrepreneur as this heroic, usually an individual, who drastically transforms productivity, is generally seen as the most important individual attribute of the entrepreneur. Now, Harvard being Harvard, it had a big econ department, and it had people who disagreed with him. And one of the people who disagreed with him was a business historian named Arthur Cole, who outlived him and wrote more directly in the scholarly literature, in the academic literature on the entrepreneur. And he had a drastically different view of the entrepreneur and the entrepreneurial function than did his colleague Schumpeter. To Cole, Schumpeter's definition was not so much wrong as incomplete and overly restrictive. Writing in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the great age of corporate America, the man in the gray flannel suit, very hierarchical American businesses, Cole, in retrospect, looks like he's doing a little special pleading for managers in general. In Cole's view, innovation is part of the entrepreneur's role and function, but only part. And there are a variety of different forms of entrepreneurship that are contingent upon one's place in an economy, the conditions of the economy at a given time, and a whole set of industry-specific factors. According to Cole, a person who is a good manager can in fact be considered to be an entrepreneur, depending on the state of a company's trajectory, it's where it is in the product life cycle, and things like that. So Cole sees a whole variety of attributes as being important to entrepreneurship, and he thinks that the singular focus by Schumpeter on one attribute is misleading and misguides students of the concept. According to Cole, there's lots of different attributes and talents and assets that have to be in place if a company is going to succeed. You could be the greatest innovator in the world, and if your company, if you aren't a good manager, can't relate to your employees, can't talk to bankers, nothing's going to happen. And he's saying it's somewhat diminishing the importance of some of these other talents to say that these people are quote unquote mere managers, while the heroic individual inventor is the person who should be accorded all the respect. If you look at Apple's early history, for example, remember Jobs and Wozniak get the thing going, and then a few years later, remember Jobs is removed, and they bring in John Scully, didn't they, from Pepsi. You know, what could be less entrepreneurial in a sense, than Pepsi-Cola in the IT world? But they bring in Scully to kind of manage the place, put some adults kind of in the management structure, because they thought that Jobs and Wozniak, but particularly Jobs, was too much of a maverick and couldn't really run a company after it had been started. Now, interestingly enough, you know the subsequent history of the company as well, and you know what happens when Jobs returns. So in many ways, what you're seeing, I think, in Cole is an attempt, some would say a rationalization or a justification for kind of big, large-scale organizations in the 50s and 60s, which had many white-collar people working in groups who he thought deserved respect as well as the kind of person who creates a startup or has a lot of patents or something like that. Most people today don't buy Cole anymore. They think that, okay, he identified some necessary functions in a business that need to be there, but he does not pay sufficient attention or accord sufficient importance to the risk bearing and the innovation, and he dilutes everything too much so as to render the whole concept, if not meaningless, at least too watered down. He also makes an interesting argument, however, and I think this part of it is kind of interesting. He is saying that a person can be a successful entrepreneur depending on where the company is in its life cycle and in its trajectory, even if it's keeping a company afloat or even quote-unquote managing decline. Given the broader economic environment, things might be so bad that a person can manage decline in such a way as to say, hey, that was a very successful entrepreneurial act, keeping this company out of Chapter 11 or Chapter 7 or whatever the case might be. So it's not only someone who has this rocketing success who can be said to be acting entrepreneurially, but given the context, someone who even manages failure in a way that is not disastrous. So that these four people really, if you're going to look at the history of the whole concept, stepping back and abstracting and say, how did this concept develop until our day? Until about the 1980s, you would say these were the people who kind of contributed most. Schumpeter has a long line of so-called Austrian economist successors who also emphasize, and some of them are still writing today, the heroic individual, and we'll talk a little bit about them today. But what about what's been going on over the last 20 or 30 years when entrepreneurship is so important? And many people start to see the rise of the contemporary interest in entrepreneurship is coming about beginning in the 1980s, when you begin to see a restructuring of the world economy, the transformation of the American economy, the collapse of some of our traditional big businesses, and the rise of some new industries in America. And of course, that was the era when Ronald Reagan, president, started wearing Adam Smith neckties and talking about the importance of capitalism and individuals and entrepreneurship in economic life. So since the 80s, there's been a lot of writing on entrepreneurship. Much of it is popular, written by journalists. Some is written by psychologists and sociologists, business writers, but also economists have also continued to write on entrepreneurship over the last couple of decades. There have been a lot of new journals that have come out over the last 30 years. Frontiers of Entrepreneurship, the Journal of Business Venturing, Entrepreneurship and Regional Development. Lots of people, quote unquote, like the sound of the word, just like Burt Jones in recent times. And let's run through a little bit of this literature. Now, a lot of people have written on the so-called psychology of entrepreneurship in the last 20 or 30 years. And there's been a lot on the characteristics, the traits, the goals, and the mindsets of people who act in an entrepreneurial fashion. Basically, a lot of this stuff goes back to the early 20th century. There were some sociologists and psychologists who wrote about kind of outlier populations or people who were marginal. And these psychologists of entrepreneurship often write on entrepreneurs as somehow being kind of out of the mainstream. And their outlierness can lead to a couple of different kinds of responses. One can be kind of social collapse or collapse of the individual into depression and neuroses, if not psychosis. The other could be this adaptive response, which is totally brilliant and unique. And They argue that it is this kind of outlierness, this kind of inability to conform that leads a subset of the people into a kind of entrepreneurial response of some kind, whether it's in the business world or it could be in another dimension. A number of other psychologists have followed up on a writer named David McClellan, who was writing in the early 60s about how societies either develop or don't develop, and how an achievement orientation in the individuals, particularly an outward directed personality that needs affirmation by society in general, leads some small proportion of the people into entrepreneurial responses or risk-taking in order to get some type of ratification and success affirmation. So that's the psychology kind of literature, is a lot on certain kinds of individual personality traits and how this is really important. Economists who have written on entrepreneurship in the last couple of decades have gone in a couple of directions. One is what we might call neo-Austrian or neo-Schumpeterian views. And these, again, push innovation. And probably the most important of these is a guy named Israel Kirzner, who had taught for many years at NYU. And he argues that the entrepreneur has a kind of unique vision or perceptiveness and can see beyond normal people in society to basically what's next. And it's this vision, perceptiveness of individuals who can have an alertness, as it were, toward profit opportunities that no one else sees, that distinguishes the entrepreneur from virtually everybody else in society. And he sees he's not as restricted in his uses as was Schumpeter, his grandfather, as it were, intellectually, but he does emphasize that not that many people have this. So there is a school of thought that continues to focus on the heroic acts of individuals in society and their role in the entrepreneurial process. More important, however, are two other approaches. One, and I think we assigned one of his readings, and I think you've done it over the course of the semester, Bill Baumel's work, another NYU professor, William Baumel, who many people think is the most important recent theorist of entrepreneurship, or at least the embeddedness of entrepreneurship into larger social and economic structures. According to Baumel, entrepreneurs exist in institutional and structural environments and cannot be understood unless in context. Baumel basically argues that entrepreneurship is relatively randomly distributed around the world. The thing that makes for an entrepreneurial society or entrepreneurial success or failure is the institutional context within which entrepreneurs work, whether it's the laws, the property protections, the incentives to enterprise of one type or another. And it is easier to change that context, to fiddle with the institutional structure, than it is to create entrepreneurs. I do a lot of work in Singapore, and the Singapore newspapers are constantly trying to encourage entrepreneurship. So you'll see articles in the Singapore Straits Times, which is a semi-official organ of the government, that'll have titles like, "Be creative, here's how." And it's impossible to kind of do that, but they think that they can kind of orchestrate things to that level. Baumel argues that it's easier to try to kind of change the institutions rather than to get individuals to change on a dime. And so he stresses the institutions, and he embeds entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship in an institutional context. To use economic speak, he tries to render it endogenous to an economic system rather than have it as some free-floating cultural variable not rooted in time or space. Lots of people buy the institutional argument of Baumol, or at least think that it's equally important and it has to be considered. Now, the last big development on entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship in recent decades is what might be called network entrepreneurship. As the 20th century went on, it became obvious to many prescient and keen observers of modern, advanced, sophisticated economies that entrepreneurship often does not occur in a garage in California or in some inventor's basement in Raleigh, but in broader contexts. And it's often the settings and the relationships, the organizational and informal relationships that are important in promoting or retarding entrepreneurship. And so there have been lots of people, really since Mark Granovetter's work in the 70s, but in the 90s and the last decade or so, who have emphasized in one way or another the importance of one's links, one's networks, one's relationships, the institutional structure of the company where someone works that is important in either retarding or promoting entrepreneurship and entrepreneurs. There's been a big literature on so-called network entrepreneurship. Most of it focuses on Silicon Valley. There's lots of writers who focus on the culture of Silicon Valley, where people are more devoted and loyal to basically ideas than to individual companies. There's lots of circulation of people in and out of various companies, but they are still loyal to the idea of whatever it is, biotech or IT in a particular case. And they are, it's the craft really, rather than the company, that is important. And so people change companies all around. There's lots of reconfigurations. But because the networks are so strong and people are arbitraging ideas and kind of exchanging things and creating new amalgams out of various types of technologies, that networks are where the action is right now. And there's been a lot of work on that particular aspect of the entrepreneur and entrepreneurship in recent times. So where we are basically today on the whole concept of the entrepreneur or entrepreneurship is really, in some ways, these early theorists are still relevant. People still talk about risks and uncertainty, and particularly uncertainty bearing. A number of people, even today, talk about the importance of uniting the factors of production and realizing profits. Profits are, ultimately the bottom line for determining whether a company, even with a good technology or good idea or a good method, is going to succeed or fail. Innovation is obviously key, but people recognize, even if they don't buy coal completely, that unless you have someone out there who is going to manage a company successfully and allocate resources and evaluate personnel, you could have the best technology and it's not going anyplace. And there have been a whole set of business studies on, various technologies going back to VCR technologies or beta technologies, and Apple versus other types of computer makers, to understand why it is that some companies succeed and others fail. And it's often things that aren't related to innovation per se, but are more properly within the province of management. So you have to ask yourself in some ways, is Steve Jobs, or is Tim Cook an entrepreneur as well as Steve Jobs? Is Steve Ballmer at Microsoft as much, or should he, or an entrepreneur, if in a different way, than Bill Gates? There are lots of attributes out there, and I think the importance of understanding the entrepreneur in his or her habitat, that is to say the institutional environment, is also important. There are billions or millions of people who I think whose entrepreneurship can be unleashed in less developed parts of the world if the institutional context changed. And that's important as well, and as is the importance of networks, differential association, who you kind of associate with. Is important in both in bringing, in changing your knowledge base and in promoting the kinds of connections and links that might be important in bringing an idea to fruition. So here's the, in 40 minutes or so, is the whole history of this concept of the entrepreneur over a couple of centuries. And I think it's fair to say that the concept is only going to become more important in the 21st century.